the reason Cheerios has 17 different kinds of Cheerios and Nabisco has 17 kinds of Chips Ahoy's is not necessarily because people want 17 different types. It's largely to protect shelf space and to make sure that another cookie brand can't get in there. So defense is not new to the retailer world, and it's not new to the brand world.
Welcome to Unlocking Retail Media, the podcast where we explore the evolving world of retail media, from data strategy to monetization and everything in between. This is the podcast that breaks down how retailers can build smarter, data-driven media networks by aligning with what brands truly need, from scalable ad solutions and meaningful metrics to cross-channel attribution and programmatic strategy. Today's guest is someone with deep insights across the retail media spectrum. Mark Mannino is the newly appointed president of VidMob, a creative data company helping brands optimize their performance through smarter data-driven content. But what makes Mark's perspective especially valuable is his journey through the very heart of retail media, spending 9 years at Amazon Ads in leadership roles, followed by 3 years at Flywheel, one of the largest retail media buyers in the world. In our conversation, we get into what brands really want, metrics that matter, smarter use of first-party data, and how retailers can make their media offerings both scalable and attractive. Whether you're building a network or refining one, there's a lot to learn in this episode.
I'm currently president at a company called VidMob, which I could probably explain later. We work on creative data. But my background, and really most relevant to Kevel and to the topics we're going to discuss, is I spent 9 years at Amazon, within Amazon Ads in a number of leadership roles. And then I spent the last 3 years at a company called Flywheel, which is pretty much the largest buyer of retail media globally across a number of different retailers. And so I'm excited to dive in with you, James. And
awesome. So yeah, I think what we really wanted to talk about today, and something that we hear a lot from the retailers that we work with, is they're thinking about, we're building a retail media network. Really it's a product they're building. The end buyer, right, is the brand, and a lot of times they're buying through a company like Flywheel, which you just came from after a nice successful exit. So I think what I'd like to talk about today is like how do retailers think about really packaging up what they're offering to these brands? What are brands looking for? How do they make their retail media network more attractive to these buyers out there?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's something that when you're working on the brand side or at an agency, you're thinking about all the time. There's a few things that if I was starting from scratch that I'd hope to nail, because that's what a Flywheel or others in the space, other agencies or marketers are going to think about. One is really understand how you're thinking about data. And there's two ways to think about the data. One is just what data are you going to use that you have as a retailer? What's unique and what's valuable? And do you have scale in that type of data that, how you're going to break it down? And you're going to allow marketers to use it, right? Either through your platform or maybe you're going to expose it on other platforms so they can apply it and they can use it in buying it. It needs to have scale and it needs to be pretty precise. So you need to think about that. The second piece of data that I think is really important is more around reporting data and analytics data, and how are you going to tell your marketer customers how everything's performing, how it's working, and ideally allow them to get their hands dirty in the data and to learn and to figure it out, because I think the days are gone, particularly in retail media, where you can just create a reporting UI and have just standard settings and let them go to town. Smart marketers now expect to be able to go in and do lots of different analysis on understanding things like incrementality, new to brand, topics like that make them think they should invest more money in a specific retailer, a retail media network.
So how do you think about, I know this is like a hot topic kind of measurement in this space, and there's, ROAS and there's iROAS and there's new to brand, and like, what is the, I've heard that agencies don't care about ROAS anymore, right? That ROAS is the old number. Like what do you see as the latest thing that agencies are really looking at?
Well, you need to bring it back, and this isn't new, but you bring it back to what are we trying to do here, right? Both the retailer and the marketer are trying to sell more stuff. That's it. So what are all the metrics that you can use to prove you're selling more stuff? That means that don't get caught up on metrics that have nothing to do with selling more stuff, and that's things like clicks or impressions or things that are really just relevant to a specific ad. ROAS, I think the reason ROAS gets a bad rap is that it's somewhat incomplete and it doesn't give you the full picture. And there are ways to make return on ad spend look really good when really nothing really happened. And that's why if you really try to understand, did I sell more things, more product? Did I literally ship more? Did more trucks with my stuff in it go to the loading dock at that retailer? How do you put together the KPIs that you want to use to measure and understand that? So I would look at a few things. One is really try and understand your incremental return on ad spend. If there's ways you can figure out, did what you're doing drive incremental sales through the reporting tools that the retailer gives you? And then secondly, important in a lot of brands is new to brand. Did a customer try my brand that hadn't tried it in the past or wasn't going to try it in the past? One thing I'd just like to go back on, because you asked me the first question, because it impacts this one, is it's really important as a retailer to understand how you're going to think about omnichannel. And by omnichannel, I mean both within the online, right? Think of the Amazon world. Everything happens online. Everything's measured, right? But at Walmart, that's not the case. 80-90% of their sales happen offline in the store. So and all other retailers are somewhere on the spectrum. And so you have to really understand, as a retailer, how am I going to give and how can I give my marketers transparency into that? And as a marketer, you have to learn and figure out how am I going to measure that? Because if I spend $1 on Walmart, it might show an online return on ad spend of X, but really the real return is probably much higher than that, right? And so you need to filter that into these metrics, and understand how you filter them into real, incremental return on ad spend and new to brand. And one example I'll give you is that that really makes this a little bit complex. Is let's just stick with Walmart for a second. If you go buy media on Walmart Connect, and you'll see, your return on ad spend of what happened on the site. You may classify someone as new to brand. They may not be. They may have been buying that brand at your local Walmart all the time, but they just finally decided to buy it or order it, or one day they needed it and they needed it quick, so they ordered it online. So just think, every retailer you work with, you're going to have to think through all of those different challenges, and the retailers need to figure out how to make sure that the marketers understand their specific nuances, because only they know and have the time or the inclination or the care to figure that out.
And is that because that seems like, especially the online, offline kind of attribution, there's ways to do that, right? I know that, whether it's tied to loyalty cards or things like that, but even that's an imperfect world, right? So is this stuff getting kind of estimated? Like if you're thinking about that Walmart, you buy on Walmart Connect, and then, are you looking at like share of category or something like that? Like how are you?
It's always estimated for a couple of reasons. One is, but you can get more and more precise around it. First of all, remember, every retail media network is a silo, right? I was at Amazon, and we used to try and drive sales on Amazon, but we'd done studies that showed that, 5 to 7 times the number of sales from ads we ran were people buying items in store. That may change over time as Amazon becomes bigger and becomes a greater share of wallet. But think about every dollar you spend on Amazon. You got to think about that. Is that driving sales in Walmart? Probably is. I think people tend to buy products where they're going to buy them anyway, and many ads they don't know that the ad is running through the, retailer X retail network. I'm not a brand marketer by background, but if you're selling, I think it all comes back to like the P&G type examples, where if you're selling toilet paper or you're selling mouthwash or whatever, the fact of the matter is you're not going to get people to buy more toilet paper. We have a limited need for how much toilet paper we need. But so what those marketers tend to do is fight over the the share of the market. And it's really important, I think, for retailers to figure out ways to give marketers a sense of how they're doing versus the overall market, or the market that they're in, right? And that they've got a good share there. Some retailers don't like to give specifics around that data, totally understandable for various competitive reasons. But I think you really need to figure out, how am I going to tell someone that they are growing within their specific category? Because there's so many other things that could impact it. For example, they may be like, oh, why my sales are going down? Well, maybe just, the retailer itself is shrinking a little bit, or it might be growing a lot, right? You may think you're really doing awesome on a retailer, but it turns out everybody else is growing faster because the retailer is growing faster. Or there could be, just economic events, the pandemic being the big one, but there could be other things that are happening that are causing people to buy less or more of your specific category. And if it's a pretty stable, mature category like that, you really need to understand, how are you really doing?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's an interesting point you brought up, is thinking about, how does this differ for different types of brands?
Yeah.
Right. If you're a CPG buyer, you're probably looking at different metrics and thinking about it differently than if you're a, DTC brand that's trying to sell some new gadget that is just a matter of how many of these can you sell. It's not essential. Yeah. It's just, you're just driving incremental sales.
Exactly. And it depends the maturity of the space, how saturated, what's the growth rate of that specific vertical, right? If it's solely new product, right? Then or a totally new category that no one's ever touched before, sure. You probably would just want to be in deep hyper growth and push. If you're in a really, really stable category that's been around for 100 years and people aren't really buying more, and it kind of grows with the economy, then you want to look at different metrics to understand how you spend and go. Let's
go. Let's jump back to, I think one of the first things you were talking about was kind of, retailer really understanding their first party data. Mm-hmm. How, I've always wondered, like, when you look at that, obviously it's the most essential part when you're doing offsite.
Yep.
How do you think that plays into onsite? Like, how important is that first party data, especially, I guess, when it comes to targeting for onsite?
It's a really good question. I think that it really depends on what consumers do on a site, right? So let's just think, maybe there's broadly, there's always three types of whatever you do, but let's just think of three types, right? There's a site, maybe like Amazon, where people tend to come on. When I go on Amazon, I'll just talk about my experience. I know exactly what I want. I buy it within 5 minutes and I'm gone, right? I don't browse on Amazon. There might be sites that are a little bit more browsy, where people go on and they spend a lot of time, right? But they might not be always like looking at, product detail pages, for example. And then lastly, there might be sites where people really never go to the site, rarely, because maybe they've subscribed to a lot of deliveries and that's all they do, and they never come back to the site. But when you get them, that experience is really, really valuable, because they're looking to subscribe to something and you can get them. How you measure those three, how you apply data to those three use cases is really different, right? Like if you've just got what we used to call spear fishers, meaning you come in, you're going to get your stuff and leave, you may not need to use data in a really sophisticated way, because the person's going to come on, they're going to search for air fryer or deodorant or whatever they want and leave. You know exactly what they want at that moment. All you need to do, you don't want to talk to them about anything else, right? But if they're browsing, if it's a place where they browse a lot, so they're not really telling you what they're looking at, or in the extreme example, well, not extreme, but the Asian market and the Asian retailer, the Asian retail consumer is very different than the American or the Western retail consumer, right? A lot of sales that happen on the retail media, on the retailers' sites in China, for example, they happen in more of a social function, right? People are there, they're watching videos, they're doing things, they see demos of products and everything. There, you've got a lot more time to apply data, and if you've got a retail site, even in the West, where people are spending a lot of time. You've got a lot more time to apply data and show them different things to try and get them interested and to increase awareness. That you really need, I would think you need a very sophisticated experience in terms of how you apply data. And then the last one, which was really just the third example around if people rarely come on, and when they come on, they do, they're subscribing or they're managing their account and that's it. I think there you need to be really, really sophisticated because you need to know this person's only come on once or twice a month or, once a quarter. You better at least, for example, if it's a pet, if it's like a pet site, know that they own a dog or a cat, right? Because you've got a very limited time to get them interested in something. So that's how I would think about it. It's really important if you're managing the retail media network to really know what type of users am I dealing with? What are they doing? And how do I think about it? And really to think like a publisher, because that's how you need to understand what your consumers do.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think especially in that subscription scenario, I think it ties back to what we talked about with metrics, where you have to have the right metrics as well, right? Because if somebody's buying something, but on average they're subscribing for 6 months, how do you make sure that you're reflecting that in the metrics versus just showing it as a single purchase? So I think that obviously is very important of how do you get that kind of lifetime value return on ad spend. Yeah.
Well, and that flows back into like I talked a little bit about reporting and analytics and letting your marketers get into the data and do their own analysis, right? Understanding how your site works, how consumers use your site, and how products flow off the site really should impact how you apply things like attribution, right? You said it, lifetime value. If the fact of the matter is like a standard 14-day window for attribution window is generally not sufficient for every type of product. There might be things where you really only need a 1-day window is appropriate because anything after that, no one's going to even think about it. But then there's products like, it's not really in retail, but a car, right? Where, or seemingly insurance, for example, at least the way marketers seem to treat us when we're watching television, that attribution window could be a year or two, right? Yeah. And so you need to understand how do you expose that data to the marketers so they can make the right decisions? Because if they constrain themselves to a really short period of time, they may underinvest because they don't really realize the impact they're having.
Yeah, it makes sense. Even like in the retailer space, like if you think about a TV versus a deodorant, right? Yeah. Like you're probably right that a day attribution window for deodorant is probably pretty fair because you either need it or you don't need it. Yeah. But a TV, you're going on there and you're looking at it and you're researching it and you're seeing if the prices are going to go up or down based on tariffs. Yeah. And, it could be a month before you spend $1,000 on a TV.
Yeah, it should be.
When we're thinking about like coming from Flywheel and thinking about, you're controlling a lot of spend or a lot of spend is flowing through you to retailers, right? Like from a more like, we've kind of talked about measurement. We talked about these things. A lot of it feels like really bespoke, right? Like it's like you're a retailer coming up with what are the right ways you measure it. Mm-hmm. How do you think about that when it then comes to, how do you make this so that it can be bought kind of programmatically or bought through a system like Flywheel where it's like it's kind of becoming like standardized? Like what are the best practices for retailers when they're thinking about, preparing for that sort of demand?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's a few things you need to understand is that the brand buyer, whether they're at a brand themselves or at an agency, has a lot to do, right? They have a lot to understand. They have a lot to think about. They don't have a moment in their time. So the first thing I would recommend is understand standards or common practices or how things are done in the industry so that you minimize the number of things that you create that are very bespoke so that people understand what you're doing and they can fit them very well into their workflow, so to speak, right? And so that they can understand and they can just allocate budget and go. And the second thing I would think of, and I think this helps, especially if you're a smaller player, is, and you talked about programmatic and things like that, because as you get small, depending on your size as a retailer, and I say small, and I don't really mean small like insignificant. I mean small like, you may have lower traffic because you're regional, or you may be in a small country, or you may be, your category is just one that people buy on monthly or quarterly instead of daily, right? So you have to be cognizant of that, and to the extent that you can take advantage of programmatic sources of demand, which don't require the media buyer to make either a decision or major workflow changes, that it just kind of happens, and it flows into their all of their campaigns, their reporting and analytics tools, and everything they use. That's obviously the best, because people will test and experiment with you, and will learn the quality of the audience and the content you can provide. Because when I look at retail media, I mean, the one thing to remember is whenever anyone's on a retailer, they're thinking of buying something, right? I mean, they've got their credit card out, or they're thinking of doing something. So it's a really, really valuable, even if the ad buyer doesn't necessarily know at that moment, or isn't thinking of buying on a retail media network. If you're in the flow of their what we call their inventory supply chain, right, so that they can actually see or buy placements on your site, the fact that those people are ready to buy things should drive and make the performance better and better, which will allow you to win more and more share over time.
What do you think about, like, one of the things I always think about, going back to kind of like measurement a little bit?
Yeah.
I always laugh that, like, we have to buy our brand name on Google, right? Like, if you go search for Kevel, we have to like run an ad with Kevel, because you want that to show up on top, even though our website is the number one organic result, but there's 6 other ads, like competitors are advertising and stuff above that. Obviously, like, that's not really effective advertising. It's like protective advertising.
Yep.
Right. When I think about retail media, one of the things I think about is, like, I know brands are a lot of times looking at incrementality. How are they driving? How are they selling new stuff? Is there a part of it that's also like protective, that you're like, I'm Coca-Cola, and so, like, if somebody goes to Walmart and searches for Coke, like, I need to advertise against Coke, just because otherwise I know Pepsi's doing it? Like, how do you think about?
Absolutely. It's yes, I don't think that's necessarily wrong or bad. I mean, if you go back to the the in-store world that we've all been living in, long before there was a retail media network. The reason Cheerios has 17 different kinds of Cheerios, and Nabisco has 17 kinds of Chips Ahoy's, is not necessarily because people want 17 different types. It's largely to protect shelf space and to make sure that another cookie brand can't get in there, right? So defense is not new to the retailer world, and it's not new to the brand world, right? But you need to be really creative in how you defend your space. Obviously, it's probably frustrating, but it's probably required that if you are, if you're Coke, for example, you want to make sure that when people search for Coke on a site, they're going to get Coke and not Pepsi, right?
Yeah.
But there's also other things that you really need to be thoughtful of, in that if you are doing a promotion, or if you think there's even an external event that's happening that is going to drive people to search for your product or your category, you need to be ready and make sure you're in there. And I'll give you a really good example. Let's say you run a Super Bowl ad, and the entire reason to run a Super Bowl ad is get people aware of your product, but they're then going to go search for, theoretically, searches for your product or even for your category should go up right after that, because you just showed your ad to 150 million people in the U.S., right? 200 million people. You better make sure that when they go do that, that the top listing on whatever major sites they're on are not for your competitor, because all you did was tell people that soda exists, and now they just went and bought your competitor, right? So, and you need to do that on all the retail media networks you're on Google, on everything like that. So, and that's a very extreme example, but I think defense is a key part of what you're doing as a marketer. And retailers should really think about how they can help brands to understand that and to work with it, and can do it in a way that it doesn't just sound like some mafia protection scheme and blah, blah, blah. You know,
Right.
if you just give me some money here, I'll make sure that doesn't happen. No, this all happens on auctions nowadays. It's not, it's you just got to understand and know how it works and make sure you're investing properly.
So for a brand is the way to think about that. Like it's almost like a separate budget. Like you're saying, this is a budget we're going to use to like protect the Coca-Cola brand, and then this is a budget we're going to use to target people that maybe aren't already adding soda to their cart. And how do we convince them that they need a 2 liter of Coke along with their healthy food they're ordering?
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, it probably is wisest. Like I said, I'm not a brand marketer, but it's probably wisest to have different budgets and how you think about that so that you could, you know, because you could also learn that maybe you only have to protect yourself every 2 weeks and you could take a week off because, you know, the other guys give up a little bit. You know, there's ways to balance, and it's a little more sophisticated than that, but there might be ways for you to save here or there. For example, let's just say a big retailer has 4 placements at the top of a search result, right? Maybe you only have to be the top, you know, 2 of the top because, geez, if they search for Coke and there's an ad for Coke there and an ad for Pepsi and an ad for RC, you know, they're probably going to click on the Coke one, and you should measure that, understand that, and think about how much are you losing by not dominating all of them, because it may get prohibitively expensive to try and block everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I'm going to take us in a little bit different direction now.
Yeah,
I think it'd be a fun topic. You didn't talk about previous to Amazon. You were at a little company called Media Math.
yeah.
Right. Media Math, for people that don't know, was one of the major DSPs, you know, competing with Trade Desk, Google, for quite a while. And so, you know, you have that, you know, similar background to myself where you spend a lot of time in traditional ad tech and traditional programmatic.
Yep.
Now that we're over in retail media, there's not a lot of actual programmatic. Right. What do you think about what do you think the future holds for, you know, programmatic and retail media? Do you think we're headed in that direction? Do you think we're not headed in that direction?
Yeah. It's a good question. First of all, Media Math still is. They still do exist.
Sorry, Media Math still exists. Sorry, everybody.
They are, you know, I think they're doing some good and interesting stuff, and some of my friends are there. But to your question, it's a couple of things, I think. Like, first of all, and I'll just, you know, I don't know if I'll have the most structured answer on this, but first of all, if you're where retailers who don't have significant scale, right, can really, really benefit from programmatic because it can really allow them to both expand their reach to their current consumers, right? Meaning, you know, I may be a ShopRite customer, but I don't only go on the ShopRite app once a month or twice a month when I'm in the store. But now ShopRite can talk to me everywhere, right? By using programmatic technology. They can also go and get other customers who don't know about ShopRite and try and bring them in, right? And do things. So understanding how that happens, I think, is really important. And then, you know, they can also take their data and extend it out and allow brands to access it on different platforms or on television places, you know, because most of these smaller retailers can't build a Prime Video, for example. They need to figure out other ways, and they could leverage the fact that there is a vibrant streaming media ecosystem out there that they can access and so they can kind of expand their reach there because the consumers aren't always on the site. You know, the other way that helps them on site is kind of relates to the answer I gave you before around the different types of consumer experience. If you're a ShopRite, for example, you only have consumers on your site for a limited time, but they may be doing different things. If you can really work on bringing in programmatic demand, things that you don't have to sell yourself, and things that tap into, you know, really active and vibrant demand systems like, you know, large DSPs like the Trade Desk, or other sources of spend. It can just really help them scale while they nurture their core, you know, probably sponsored ads type retail media placements.
And how do you like? I was actually at a conference the other day, and somebody was talking about programmatic and retail media, and they were kind of giddy about, hey, like programmatic is coming to retail media. And I think you're right. Like I think in a lot of these cases, like if you're a smaller regional grocer, right, like you're not gonna get the brands coming to spend with you. Like programmatic makes a ton of sense. But my immediate thought was, thinking about the history of programmatic and traditional ad tech and how, publishers in general got really commoditized.
Yeah.
And so you went from where, oh, you were a publisher and you were paying your writers, great salaries and you were commanding $50 CPMs to where you were, creating listicles because it was all just about how do you get as many impressions as possible. And, do you worry about that when you think about if you're a retailer thinking about programmatic, like do you worry about like just becoming commoditized?
It's a really good point. I'll expand on something I've been saying is because I think you should worry about it if you just blindly throw your site and your impressions into a random supply chain, right? Because then you will just be in there. No one will really value you for what you are, and I think publishers, non-retail media publishers, have learned this lesson. And while to some extent, the horse has left the barn, but by really working hard on private marketplace deals, which for those who don't know, allows a buyer, a marketer, to buy programmatically from a specific publisher or for a group of publishers at a set price. So it can take the auction out of the situation, or it can at least put in a floor to the price. But it really values and allows the marketer to value that specific publisher or a group of publishers. And given the high quality that I attribute to retailers and retailer sites, again, back to having a credit card in your hand, making sure that you understand and are part of private marketplace decision making, both within, and now there's also a lot of curation going on, which is just a more advanced way of doing private marketplace and making sure that the dollars go to the right publisher or site is really critical. So working with both your retail media tech partner, your SSP if you have one, and the DSP, and building those relationships, I think, is really important. And then it won't happen, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think there's a lot that retailers can learn from what publishers went through.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the publishers today that are still commanding a premium are doing exactly the kind of things you said, right? Which is focusing on their data, focusing on PMPs, focusing on, the experience. And so I think that it makes sense. If retailers do the same thing, they can hopefully avoid the fate that a lot of traditional publishers ran into.
Yeah, exactly.
So thinking about, we're talking about kind of got into programmatic. And so thinking about offsite, right, which we touched a little bit on offsite earlier. I think there's a question that a lot of retailers have. There's kind of like a fork in the road of how they think about offsite, and it's do they make their data available everywhere, right, or other places, right? Like, do they go and say, hey, you can use our data on the trade desk, you can use our data, here it is in LiveRamp, go use it wherever, or do they control that and say we're going to control the sale and targeting of our data? How do you think a retailer should think about that decision? Because I think it's a big decision that I think a lot of them kind of quickly pick one way or the other.
Yep.
But I think it's a big decision of whether they're gonna really let their data be out there and usable everywhere. Which I know there's retailers doing that approach, and there's retailers that say no. If you want it, call up our sales reps, and we will handle setting this up or making it available to you.
So there's no scenario where you shouldn't control it, and I mean, even if you just let it go through a DSP and let others use it, you should really be understanding and evaluating where is it going, how are marketers using it, are they finding value. I would never just let the data just go into almost unfettered into some tool, right? Even the DSPs and SSPs will work with you nowadays, especially if you're big enough, to get to work with advertisers to beta test and to evaluate how something works and to give you feedback. I think that after you get outside the top 2 or 3, retailers who it's easy for them to say, we won't let our data go anywhere, because a lot of people everyone will just have to buy directly from them, right? That's what Amazon did, right? That's what Walmart does. As you get into the middle of tier of retailers who are large brands that all of our moms know, but may not be large enough that marketers are going to do dedicated work with them, then you have to think about how you'll release your data, how you'll expose it in different ways. And I just think you really need to be thoughtful and make sure you build some sort of a learning agenda over time about how you do it. And you really understand what value am I getting back, right? How much revenue am I really getting by exposing this data? And then make the right decision. I'll give you a good example. I think this is the Instacart that has their own platform, right? They did a deal with Roku, right, where their data could flow through, and people buying media through Roku's ad platform could apply Instacart data and learn how the campaign, and they'd learn how it performs and everything. And I think that's a really good example. And Instacart's large, obviously, and so is Roku, so it's perfect because it's a large data set with a large user base. But it's very controlled, right? There's no chance it's going to go anywhere. I'm sure they meet every week or every month and go through the results and what advertisers buying from us. It's not just like, hey, I'll throw it into this SSP and see what happens, or this DSP and see what happens, and tell me how it goes.
Yep. No, I think that makes total sense. And I think, in a lot of ways, this first-party data is one of the most valuable things these retailers have.
Yeah.
And they need to make sure they're protecting it and not just spreading it to the wind. And because there are, as we learned in traditional ad tech, there's plenty of ways to take that data and co-opt the cookies and, drop your own cookies on those users and then do whatever you want with it. So
yeah, and there's also there's a consumer risk too. I mean, as the world becomes tighter and tighter, appropriately and rightly, on how marketers and platforms can use consumer data, even if the ROI is, let's say the ROI is just positive, and you're like, oh, this is good. Like, really think about where you're letting your data go, who's making the decision on how to use it, and things like that. Because if you're a retailer, a publisher has to do certain things. The only way they make money is through ad revenue, unless they have subscription, and that's a small set of publishers. But if you're a retailer, your consumers have probably decades of experience with you and a glow around you, whether you're Winn-Dixie or ShopRite or Tesco, it doesn't matter. And if you find out that they're just using your data to do whatever and letting anyone do it, irrespective of of whether that's legal or not, which is a thing you need to think about, really think about what the impact would be. I mean, at Amazon, we used to always say, and this is early days when we were fighting against the grain in terms of you can't use our data anywhere. We always said to ourselves, we're the only major publisher out there that our visitors, our users pay us, right? And it's really, you really need to hold that relationship precious.
Yeah, I think it goes back to one of the things I tell retailers a lot, which is the number one job in RMN is first do no harm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Like the number one job is first do no harm. You can't hurt the core business. Yeah. You can't drive users away. You can't break the trust that you have with these decade-long customers. So yeah, 100% agree on that.
Don't be in the Wall Street Journal. Don't get your CEO on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Yes.
Don't do that.
Yeah, you don't. You do not want that call from your CEO. Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, I think Mark, this has been great. Great having you on the show. I think this is a lot of valuable information for retailers out there thinking about how do they really package themselves up and what are brands thinking about? How do they think about the key different kind of measurement approaches, how they're working with first party data on-site and off-site. So it's been great having you on. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, James. I appreciate it.
That was Mark Mannino. To learn more about Mark's work, connect with him on LinkedIn. And to learn more about VidMob, visit vidmob.com. Thanks for tuning in to Unlocking Retail Media. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share this show with your network. We'll be back soon with more insights to help you navigate the future of retail media. See you next time.